It is the top of the hour, so we're going to get started. I love the activity in the chat. For those of you who joined in the last couple of minutes, you know what to do. Drop your name, introduce yourself in the chat so we have a better appreciation for who's joining us. I'll introduce myself, not in chat, but verbally. So my name's Tina Walla from US Digital Response, and I'm your moderator for this session. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's FormFest 2023 session, titled Designing Inclusive Forms with the US Web Design System. You heard in the intros from Lynn and Amanda, as well as from Mina. Everyone's got their formative form story. I'll share with you one of mine. It really resonated when Amanda spoke about her experience. One of my formative form stories is filling a form, all the forms required to sort of get ready for college, because my mom, who's an immigrant, isn't as familiar with some of the sort of more bureaucratic legalese. And so today is bringing me back to that. And I'll tell you, I'm glad I'm done with college. So this is a 1-hour session. Our speakers are going to present first, and we will then save the last 20 minutes for questions and answers. If a question comes up for you during the presentation, please use the chat. And we're going to moderate the questions out loud so that for the recording, we capture those. We've got somebody keeping an eye on the chat. Thanks, Juliana. So drop them there, and we're going to keep track of them and bring those up during the Q&A portion at the end of our session. But at this point, enough of my rambling. Let's get started. I want to turn it over to Austin Hernandez and Ann Petersen, who will get us started by sharing their formative form story. Austin and Ann, take it away.
Yeah, my formative form story is I have been spending a lot of time in the doctor's office recently, and filling out these forms is just such a nightmare. Invasive questions. Why are you asking me this? I have no idea. How is this going to help me? Wow, this language is really outdated. Can't stand it. It's been a struggle. What about you, Anne?
Well, the system just kicked me out for a second, so I'm not sure I heard a lot of that, but I will say that my formative form story, I suppose, is that I just bump into forms all over the place where I cannot specify who I am appropriately because there are no options there for that. But yeah, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, right on. I think a lot of people are having that problem. So I will start by introducing myself. My name is Austin Hernandez. My pronouns are he and him, and I am a senior product designer at 18F. And so for people who are listening only to this presentation, I will be giving visual descriptions of myself and my slides. I am a brown, masculine presenting person. I'm Latinx with a $1 million smile and a ring in my nose. For people who can see and hear me, I'll be reading mostly from these slides so people who are only looking at slides can follow along.
Thanks, Austin. I'm Anne. My pronouns are they, them. In the interest of inclusion and accessibility, I'm a white person with short brown hair and small brown glasses in a plaid shirt today. There's a lot of plants behind me. So I wanted to provide kind of an upfront reminder that in government, we serve the public, like everyone in the public, ultimately. Even if your work is to improve government itself, ultimately, that government exists for the benefit of people, individuals, like folks kind of like these, colorful and varied cartoony characters we see on this slide, but a little bit more real. Today, we'll talk about designing and building inclusive forms using the United States Web Design System and its human-centered design. I'll note before we get too far that a lot of what we'll discuss is culturally and US government dependent. So if you're working with an international product, service, or site, or a government outside the US, or for a tribal nation, our recommendations may or may not be applicable. So we'd recommend you do your own research in that case. But being human-centered, at least, is probably applicable for you. But let's talk about whether a design system might be. A design system, for those not familiar, is a toolkit to support design and development problem solving. It contains the building blocks of principles, guidance, and code used to build a digital service. Organizations use design systems to capture and coordinate solutions and guidance across teams and projects. Design systems collect the solved problems, so you don't need to solve them again. Today, design systems are being used in organizations big and small, in the private sector, in governments around the world, and here in the US government. This slide shows the website for the US Web Design System, or USWDS, which is an acronym you'll hear us say a lot today. Even within the American federal government, different agencies and products might have their own design system, but we intend that USWDS be the common, familiar set of building blocks that connects them. Design systems help designers by modularizing existing solutions, by building a collection of solutions that work together, and by taking those solutions apart into functional bits and pieces that you can mix and remix. In doing so, design systems develop a common language of design solutions. So what is this common design language, these common solutions that we share? At the broadest level, I would say that we share principles, that is, agreements about how and why we're working. So USWDS has 5 common principles that teams across the federal government share. First, we start with real user needs. So real user needs inform our design decisions. As we work, we need to be testing our assumptions early and often. To do this, we include real people in the design process from the beginning. We earn trust. Trust has to be earned every time. It's hard to build and easy to lose. So a critical part of earning trust is understanding and meeting expectations. We also need to be reliable, consistent, and honest, and a good steward of our audience's data, resources, and time. We embrace accessibility. Accessibility isn't a checkbox, it's about respect. We should make it personal. These are people we're building for. And standards are only the beginning. We want to design broadly and generously for the individuals and groups that we serve. We promote continuity, and that's continuity, not strict uniformity. Continuity acknowledges the reality and necessity of both change and difference, especially in a federated government model like our own. So this is less uniformity than connectivity and dynamic consistency. So that's, dynamic consistency between sites and services, dynamic consistency throughout a service, dynamic consistency across devices, and dynamic consistency over time. And finally, we listen. Feedback makes this process work. We need to be open and share. We also need to listen to data and design with data. And experiences are included in data. And we need to be proactive. So listening often means asking, encouraging, and moving beyond the loudest voices, and then turning that listening into action. But remember these folks from the beginning? I mean, not just the colorful, cartoony characters again, but the humans, the users, the real people in our audience. It's important to remember that we're doing what we do for reasons that go beyond conformance, consistency, and efficiency. We're doing this to develop great digital services for the very real people who make up our audiences and need them. Our USWDS principles serve as a reminder that the nuts and bolts of the design system can only take you so far. They're just tools and techniques in the service of greater goals. So moving on to guidance. So accessibility and usability are highly interrelated. USWDS user experience and implementation guidance connect these ideas when it comes to building and using components that do what people expect them to do. The USWDS website is a plain language resource for practical usability advice drawn from research and experience. That's our own research and experience and the research and experience of teams across the US federal government. It's guidance that's meant to be relevant regardless of how you customize your site or service. Together, these principles and this guidance become the grammar of our common design language, an expressive commonality shared across US federal agencies and project teams that use it, and all of us should. Because as we know, believe it or not, websites are more than buttons and form fields on a screen. Websites and services are interactions and tasks, things that people do, things we ask people to do. There are all kinds of tasks and interactions on a website, some simple and some complicated. These are things like helping users check their answers, confirm eligibility, recover from an error, check application status, and update their information. These are interactions like asking users for addresses, passwords, family details, and personal information. All of these things are common interactions that we see from site to site, service to service. These are interactions common to current and future services. They aren't going away. And in some important ways, these interactions may also be solved problems, just like the building blocks of icons and buttons. Today, the US web design system features guidance for 17 common patterns, like providing a name, a date of birth, an address, a phone number, gender identity or sex, or a social security number. Or to move through complex forms, indicate language preference, or find multilingual content, among others. Our inclusive design patterns you can find at designsystem.digital.gov/together. There's a screenshot of that page here. We'll be dropping the links out at the end. And Austin will be going into these in a lot more depth in a moment. Our patterns generally, you can find at designsystem.digital.gov/patterns with a preview of that in this screenshot here. One example might be our language selection pattern. Again, we're showing a screenshot here. Or asking for an address, another screenshot here. But as you may or may not know, federal digital presences in the US must abide by this law called 21st Century Integrated Digital Experience Act, or 21st Century IDEA, which you can go look up if you'd like. We'll also share a link to that. And a recent Office of Management and Budget memo interprets this law. This memo is M-2322, delivering a digital-first public experience. It includes 100+ actions for agencies, but one I might pick out in particular is to conduct inclusive research. Even before this memo was released, our hypothesis has been if we can get things right for users with disabilities, we're on the right track. It's not the whole story, but it gets us started right. So recently we did research with people with visual impairments, 5 total in this round, 3 blind, 2 with some vision. 3 of them used a screen reader alone. 1 added screen magnification to that, and the 5th just used screen magnification without a screen reader. And their past experience in using these assistive technologies kind of varied a lot. These were remote moderated usability tests of 1 hour and 20 minutes via video call as kind of a semi-structured interview with a fictional scenario where our participants interacted with a semi-functional prototype while describing their thoughts out loud. In the course of this test, and it was a long one, with the extra 20 minutes added to basically ensure that we could work well with their assistive technology, we tested 8 of our components: accordion, character count, combo box, date picker, file input, input mask, step indicator, and validation. We also compensated our research participants, which helped with them being willing to participate. For that 1 hour and 20 minutes, we compensated them $100, which we increased from $75 when we added the 20 minutes onto the hour, which we definitely needed for that extensive a test. It was probably too many things at once, which made it long, and we'll likely cut it back in the future. For these research results and others, we're starting to publish our usability research findings in our repository's wiki and linking to it from the relevant component pages on the site. On the right, you can see a draft describing this research, or at least a portion of its summary. But to dive further into data collection, I'm going to pass over to Austin.
Hey, thanks, Anne. It's me, Austin. I'm back again. And as Anne was just talking about, the importance of starting with real users' needs. But first, I want to make it clear that it's really important for you to understand what your agency really needs and why. So a lot of times we see confusing, cumbersome, wordy paper forms get turned into the digital version of themselves. And on the screen, I'm showing such a lengthy paper on the left, and onto the right of it is a paper form in an online format. This is a good time to think about how your form can be meaningfully improved and updated to meet the needs of your users. And next, you should really think about how the data will be used, stored, and secured. I am showing an example from vote.gov and their RAP report on how they made a more inclusive form to recruit participants for usability testing. They wrote, building trust with participants begins with how we ask for, manage, and protect their information. We look to increase individual agencies over their own data, make informed choices, and mitigate harm that might be caused by sharing any data, actual or perceived threats. So sharing how data will be used and secured can also help build trust. Next, data collection is extractive. There's a very sordid history in data collection as a practice, and just because we're asking people a few questions online doesn't mean it can't potentially be harmful. I wanted to show this from the Bureau of Justice Assistance, a reminder that tribal nations are sovereign nations, and tribal nations' inherent sovereign authority to administer the collection, ownership, and application of their own data is rooted in tribal nations' rights to govern their own people. And indigenous data sovereignty is the right of a nation to govern the collection, ownership, and application of its own data. This is a global issue. It's not just applicable to American Indians and Alaska Natives here in the continental United States. So protect people, tribes, and their data. And consider the repercussions of publishing data findings about different groups of people. You can consult with tribal leaders or review boards to make sure that the data is reflective of the people that have provided it. And lastly, find meaningful ways to give information back to communities that provided data. Establish more equitable access for tribes to access data collected on their people. So 3 good rules of thumbs for the building blocks of a form: collect relevant data, clean data, provide transparency and get consent, and create inclusive experiences. And to clarify, inclusive is kind of a buzzword that gets thrown around a lot. And what I mean by inclusive in this context is giving users a sense of belonging. It's part of a diversity, equity, inclusivity, and accessibility framework used by the US Web Design System patterns. To foster diversity is to make sure a broad variety of perspectives are represented. Equity is just creating more fair and just outcomes and make it accessible. So regardless of disability or condition, people should be able to have access to the digital experiences that work for others. And now I'm going to talk about some of the user profile patterns on the web design system, which are just some good rules in collecting personal information. And as Anne mentioned earlier, there's 17 patterns, and I'm going to go deeper on 5 of them. There's a 5 asterisks because I'm counting the 4 language patterns as one large language pattern. And I chose these because these questions we find that people are the most reluctant to fill out, or I see them misdefined or misused. They're mostly sensitive pieces of data, so I wanted to give y'all more context. So I'm showing a screenshot of the Create a User Profile page on the USWDS. The URL is on the screen, but we're going to get this to y'all at the end. And it can be accessed at designsystems.digital.gov. And first I'm going to talk about names. It's one of our biggest senses of self and identifiers. So I'm showing a bad example here. We have someone's legal name, Joe Hernandez Cruz, with an error message to enter a valid name. It says your name must be between 3 and 15 characters, can't contain special characters or spaces. So support text fields for names between 1 and 128 characters. Some people have long names, some people have short names. Let a person put in their name. Support a rich array of diacritics, accents, and alternative characters, and allow users to enter more than one name in each field. So I have an example here with the pattern of collecting first or given names, some examples like Jose, Darren, or Mai, and a field for a middle name, and a last or family name with some examples here, Martinez, Gonzalez, Gu, or Smith. And here on the screen, I'm showing an example of a full name field that allows for an apostrophe or bicapitalization, with the name LeBron O'Hare being a completely legitimate name that shouldn't be an error. And just make sure that long character counts, accent marks, and etc. don't break your database. I have an image on screen with the last name Hernandez with an accent mark, dash Cruz being accepted by an online form, but creating an error in a very sad looking database. And the next pattern is race and ethnicity. And again, everyone out here confusing these two. So I want to provide a little bit more context, definition, etc. So race is not the same as ethnicity, and that's not the same as nationality. These are distinct concepts that I will help define for y'all. So get a pen, tell your friends. Here is this quote is from the National Human Genome Research Institute at NIH, or the National Institutes of Health. And genome.gov's genetic glossary has a quote here from their acting deputy director, Vince L. Bonham Jr., that race is a political and social construct that is fluid. Racial categorization can change over time, place, and context. Race has been used historically to establish a social hierarchy whereby individuals are treated differently, resulting in racism. And since racial categorization is contextual, provide the context and parameters. So in the US, racial categories are provided by the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. And an example of it being contextual is that when I lived in the UK, their census had completely different racial options. And also, the census in 1900 looked a lot different than it does in 2020. And that's also what I mean by it's contextual. So there are 5 racial categories in the US. They are American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native American or other Pacific Islander, and white. That does not mean that there are only 5 ways to define yourself. And on the screen right now, I'm showing the USWDS pattern, showing an example of how to ask for racial identity. It says, which of the following race classifications best describes you? Select all that apply. And then it has, for example, Black or African American and white. It has more than 5 races listed here. It adds Middle Eastern or North African and some other race. Again, the addition of Middle Eastern is showing why race isn't an actual science and how it's contextual. So allow people to select more than one race. And why? Because the 2020 census shows that in the US, 2 or more races population at 33.8 million people. That's up from 9 million people in 2010, which is a 276% increase and probably going to keep increasing. And so here we have the definition of ethnicity, which is a large groups of people who have certain cultural, linguistic, religious, and or other traits in common. But OMB's category for ethnicity is Hispanic or Latino or nah, basically, which is not very exhaustive considering the definition of ethnicity. It's just, are you or are you not Hispanic or Latino? And race and ethnicity are often very central to an individual's sense of self. So explain why race and ethnicity information is being collected and how this information will be used. And here's an example from vote.gov, which I thought was a good example of how to explain why they're using this information. It says, we are trying to better understand how ethnicity and race impact barriers and access to voting. Please share your ethnicity and or race if you feel comfortable doing so. So ask for race and ethnicity as a two-part question as currently required by OMB or whatever your governing body might be. And if possible, allow users to self-identify their ethnicity. So here is the USWDS's example of race and an open ethnicity field. It's being asked in a group of questions, but not as the same question. So OMB requires that race and ethnicity map to their categories of the 5 races and Hispanic or Latino, but they also encourage more detailed race and ethnicity information as long as it ladders up to these categories. And for context, I wanted to share with y'all my genetic testing for ancestry results. It shows 44.5% Southern European, 40.8% Native American, 4% Sub-Saharan African, and 4% Western Asian and North African. So this is very representative of the colonization of the United States, and it's a lot of fun for world history buffs out there, but this data isn't very meaningful, or how does it help people solve for problems? And my racial background isn't an anomaly. Here's data from the 2020 census that showed that people who identified as ethnically Hispanic or Latino, which is over 62 million people, not including the island of Puerto Rico, 32.7% identify as 2 or more races, and 42.2% identify as some other race. So that's over 46 million people and more than half of the Latino population in the US. Again, this data excludes the island of Puerto Rico, which is a US territory. So use meaningful categories for your program and allow self-identification if possible. Vote.gov did a really great job of this in their example. They adapted the pattern from the US web design system onto a web-based survey administration software. They have the explanation on top of why this is important information, that they're trying to better understand impact of barriers in access to voting. And they asked if you would share your ethnicity and race if you're comfortable. They have an open question that asks, what culture or ethnicities do you identify with? And provided examples. And then they asked the OMB required question. Do you identify as Hispanic or Latino? Yes, no, prefer not to answer, and then race. And they noted that these categories are derived from OMB guidelines and to select all that apply. And I have an example of what not to do where this form has a dropdown of race/ethnicity, and it uses a gender-inclusive Hispanic or Latinx option, but forces people to choose just one race and a Latinx person to choose between their race or their ethnicity. So again, don't conflate race and ethnicity. They're two different things. Or have someone forced to choose between their ethnicity or their race. And next we have gender identity and sex. And here is a quote from census.gov. While often used interchangeably, sex and gender are two distinct concepts. So don't conflate gender with sex or pronouns. You can't necessarily infer one from the other. So ask about sex and gender identity separately. And I will talk about definitions. What do I mean when I talk about gender identity? From genome.gov, gender is an evolving term, and there are different definitions. In a general sense, gender involves how a person identifies along a broad, fluid spectrum rather than strictly by the sex assignment they received at birth. Gender does not always directly relate to sex assigned at birth. And this is from genome.gov. So help users by defining terms. For the VA or the Department of Veterans Affairs, they provide a definition and parameters that they've set. They state that gender identity is how you think about yourself, and they provide options, which are male, female, transgender female, non-binary, other, or does not wish to disclose. And then provide helper text that explains why you're asking for this data and who it will be shared with. And the VA makes it very clear how gender identity is used. Gender identity helps VA staff and providers know your identity and use respectful terms during interactions when delivering personalized care. And keep in mind that many terms that describe gender identities have evolved over time. And this terminology continues to evolve. So this is a quote from the White House's recommendation on collecting sexual orientation and gender identity data on federal statistical surveys. They say that the terminology is fluid and evolving, and it's difficult to find response options that both comprehensively reflect LGBTQI+ identities that are universally understood, particularly for youth and young adults. So it's important to test terminology with a broad range of respondents or rely on previously tested terminology. So be inclusive, be respectful, and listen for changes in terms and conventions. And historically, the federal government has asked people to choose between male and female. But recently, agencies and programs have been moving towards providing more options, reflecting the fact that a person's gender identity may not reflect the sex they were assigned at birth, and that sex is not always unambiguously male or female. So I have on screen 2 examples of exclusionary form designs, which are required titles or honorifics that don't have non-binary options, and a binary gender selection, which says gender, you must be male or female, and has a radio button. So allow people to specify their gender identity in their own words. Provide examples for them for people who may not know what you're talking about, and include prefer not to answer. So support long text fields for gender identity instead of fixed lists of options, and have helper text that explains, for example, man, woman, non-binary, and a checkbox that says prefer not to share. Because there are safety issues in asking for this information. So you need to balance the need for this information and against potential privacy risk. So if you don't need to know, don't ask. And another example is from the State Department, which shows the X gender marker that's available on US passports starting April 11th, 2022. And I have a copy of the form for a US passport where it has a section that says gender, M, F, or X. And from the Department of State, they set parameters for gender. There's male, female, or X, which means unspecified or another gender identity. And while unspecified or prefer not to answer isn't straightforward or what I would really consider clean data, it can provide a data ambiguity to help keep people safer, non-binary people who may show up in a database or maybe put together with other people who don't want to disclose this information. So next, let's talk about sex. I tried not to sing that. But yes, here we have a definition from genome.gov. They are always coming through with these definitions. So sex refers to the physical differences like chromosome composition, anatomy, and physiology among people who are born male, female, or intersex. So clearly state why you need this information and what it will be used for. Hint of the season, this is pretty much like ubiquitous. You should always do this. And here's the VA again, the Department of Veterans Affairs. They say that your birth sex is the box that was checked on your original birth certificate. Options are male or female. Again, this may not be true anymore. It's not true anymore universally, but this is their definition. And how is birth sex used? They have that it's used here at the VA to guide medical care. And the ways that this might be used are in their record management system, letting people know about sex-specific interventions with medical care. A really helpful framework to use is I need to ask for a person's blank so that I can blank. Or I need to ask for a person's date of birth so that I can verify their identity. There are patterns for that. Wow. This pattern on the USWDS is matching an original birth certificate. They have sex listed at birth. Please enter the sex that appears on your original birth certificate. Use an X for a sex listed on your birth certificate that is neither male nor female. Then they also have one for matching any qualifying legal document. Legal sex, again, matching a specific document. It has a specific need that it is transparent to the person who is inputting this data to feel comfortable in doing so. And the research is ongoing. TBD, ... So learn from people and communities. Learn from the people that you're working with. Yeah. Next, we have pronouns. Different than gender, different than sex. And why you might need this information is if you need to refer to someone in third person or need to let other people know how to refer to this person. Sometimes it asks me what my pronouns are when they are really trying to ask what my gender identity is. So this is probably a better use case for it. If you don't need a controlled vocabulary, let people enter their pronouns in their own words. So this is an example where you are saying that it is the pronouns. What is a pronoun? An example is he, she, they, ze, or he/they. You can prefer not to share. Again, clearly state why you need this information, provide examples, and not everyone will know what they are. So this is really helpful context. For example, he, she, they, ze, he, they. And last, yeah. Support for multiple languages. Here's a screenshot of the select a language pattern from the USWDS. There are 4 different language patterns available where you can select between 2 languages, 3 or more, multilingual, and indicate your preferred language. And why is this important? Contrary to popular belief, the US does not have official language. This is from USA.gov. There's more than people speak or sign more than 350 languages in the United States. And from the US Census, nearly 68 million people spoke a language other than English at home. And this isn't to say that these people don't speak English, but like Tina was saying earlier, it may be harder for people to understand some of these complexities, and the burden falls a lot on children or friends and family who need to be able to translate these things. And it's really not even easy for people who are native English speakers sometimes to understand these forms. So plain language goes a long way. Here's an example of the multilingual content pattern. Again, a whole bunch of these patterns. All of these are listed online. Links are going up in the chat. And let's see. Oh, yeah. This is awesome. I put citations so y'all didn't know I was lying or not, calling my bluff. You can click on these links, find the information for yourself, use them when you're talking to your people at your agency and say proof that genome.gov says this, VA says this, etc. The end, understand your audience. It's important to know and understand them. It doesn't mean that your content needs to be translated in 350 languages, but if you're working with undocumented populations, you might want to think more about language translations. It's not a definitive or exhaustive guide, and I'll just leave you with some ways that vote.gov worked towards a more inclusive form using guidance that came from the USWDS. But they looked at it from many different angles. Plain language, providing more in-context clarity. They provided options for anonymity. They only asked necessary questions and asked people what they felt comfortable filling out. And this form was written in Spanish and English, and they got a ton of feedback from a diverse group of people and provided information on how to be removed from databases. So we'll go to questions. Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun. Ann and Austin, thank you so much. I don't know if you have a full appreciation of this since you've been presenting, but the chat has been really lively and there's a lot of excitement. So there's a bunch of questions covering, touching on topics like user research, form design, getting into some of the pattern guidance. So I'm going to start with a quick question to get us started, but then we'll dive into those different categories. Yes, and first, just everybody, you can't see the audience, Austin and Ann, but you're getting a lot of love in the chat, which is great. So let me start off with a quick question, which is it safe to assume that any component pulled from the US web design system is 508 compliant?
Right, I will field that one. I think I started trying to reply in the chat, so some of them might have replies that are useful with links even.
Great.
But in brief, I will say that if it is not 508 compliant, we don't ship it. Let's start there, okay? So as far as we know, everything that we put out is compliant. However, once you take it and implement it, you may implement it with tweaks or customization, or make sure that it fits your site or service or your audience in specific. And as soon as you do that, you will need to test it again. So we provide guidance on that and how to do that. We're actually also about to, I don't know how soon this is, but we will start having accessibility checklists, essentially, so that people can kind of go through and know what they need to double check and how.
I love that. I think that's such a great tangible example of the types of resources that 18F puts out. You'll make it really easy to, you sort of demystify and make it less intimidating to take
in
some
this case,
exceptions.
this is right. In this case, this is the US Web Design System specifically.
Gotcha.
18F does also have a bunch of great resources like their guides, one of which is a specific accessibility guide.
Boom. Thank you. And I think this is another question for you, you know, and this is something that is top of mind for folks, it looks like based on the chat. How did you find participants for the research you did? Can you walk us through that a little bit just to help folks understand how might they approach that in their communities?
Yeah, absolutely. So the approach we used was contacting advocacy organizations, community organizations that support folks with disabilities of various types, to find out if they had folks that, you know, were available, might be interested, under what circumstances, and, you know, that sort of thing. So there's, we do have to be delicate here and make sure that we're storing the data safely, because that is not only personally identifiable information, PII, but it is also health data. So you have to be very careful about that. And we definitely use, which is a, you know, best practice anyway, essentially like a place to put the participants' information that is only available to the researchers, and then do kind of a code name for the notes. So even the notes don't have the, you know, name or personal information associated with them.
Wow, okay. Let me ask a quick follow-up question that one of our attendees submitted. Did researchers use a special platform to test using assistive tech? Can you speak to that a little bit in terms of the tools you used?
Yeah, tools we used actually were just what you would use normally. So a video call that was recorded, that's essentially it. So there was no special tech needed.
Good to know. For everybody out there, like, you don't need that any special platform, but being able to leverage the tools that a lot of us use more regularly. That's great, Ian.
Yeah, I will say building in that extra time to make sure that like the recording was picking up their screen reader speaking, that sort of thing, very important.
That's great. Let me move us to form design. We got a few questions about form design, one of which I think is sort of builds on the user research topic. So one of our attendees said, you know, often in form design, there's legalese that is interpreted to be inflexible, usually by a compliance-focused party. And sometimes that's even in the framing of the questions. I feel this very much. I think this really rings true from my experience. Question for you both is, what advocacy tools have you found effective for bringing accessible language higher on the priority list?
I'm certain Austin has more to add here, but I'm going to start with like showing the usability tests where people struggle, at least via audio if possible, quotes as a fallback, but like people seeing it happen really makes a difference. And then also going back to the law or the guidance or whatever it is that dictates the form or is perceived to dictate the form, and actually reading it. Sometimes it ends up being like the way we've always done it rather than how it's actually described in the law that it comes from. And I would also note that like having a good relationship with your lawyers also helps.
Great tips. Austin, I want to welcome you in if you have anything you'd want to add on that.
Just say that we have some like content people that really can take all this legalese and translate it into plain language, and they are the unsung heroes of many projects that have found really creative ways to incorporate the legalese. I find that like sometimes saying like, what does this mean? Or having a glossary link, a tooltip that provides extra context so that it can have the legalese in there, in addition to the plain language, fills the needs of both parties, like the legalese and then also a user.
That's really helpful. And Austin, there's a lot of excitement about leveraging content designers to be able to sort of bring things into plain language whenever possible. So That's fantastic. I want to get to some questions that came up as you all were talking about the various patterns and the pattern guidance. First one I'll share is one of our attendees shared, I've heard some pushback using American when referring to Indigenous natives. It would be great to understand the appropriateness of the most proper terms so as not to perpetuate our historical biases. How would you both sort of suggest we all think about that based on your work?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on this.
I love that you leaned in, Austin.
Yeah, so I'll say this. There is the term American Indian, Alaska Native is the exact government term that I'm talking about, like with OMB defined. That's a very specific thing. It's people who can prove by blood quantum or prove that they are an American Indian, and that was defined by the federal government. So that is a very specific group of people that have a tribal ID. They're affiliated with, Cherokee Nation, and that is a distinct identity. It's a legal identity. That's different than Native American or Indigenous people, which is kind of like the bucket group of these people. But American Indian has kind of like a special designation. And I agree. The terminology in working with these groups, you wouldn't say, oh, that's, an American Indian person. That's kind of like fallen out of favor, but it's maybe not thought of as politically correct, but it is correct in that that's the designation of these groups of people by the federal government. You can also use terms of like, if you know the person's tribe, saying someone of the Cherokee Nation. If you're unsure, you can use blanket terms like Indigenous people, Native American, which is also again specific to this part of the world. Indigenous peoples could be people in Australia or New Zealand. So it is a very contentious term. Some people identify as Indian, some people don't. But that's a good question. The Bureau of Indian Affairs has a lot of information on this.
Okay.
And I suggest that's something to look into too.
Excellent. Thank you, Austin. I want to build on that a little bit and share another question we got from our audience. Can you share more about considerations for how caseworkers, very important users of data provided in forms, how caseworkers could process this new, more representative information? In previous explorations of more inclusive race and ethnicity sections with state partners, this audience member mentioned that they've gotten some pushback, that this shifts administrative burden to workers. How do y'all think about that in terms of, right, the form design and making it more inclusive is one piece, and then there's the folks who are going to then use that data to better serve their sort of their customers or clients, if you will. How do y'all think about that?
I think by the way that I've gotten around it is just by saying, again, like race is just a social construct that the parameters are set by X, Y, and Z. So being explicit about this isn't, how you necessarily define yourself. It's like, if you ask me if I'm a circle or a square, it's just like, that's so random. But if you tell me, oh, a circle is more roundy and a square is more edge, then I'm like, I guess I'm more a circle. So I feel like just providing the context for the people that you're working with and saying like, these are just the parameters that we have, instead of trying to change OMB census data, like those aren't inclusive, period. And what's more inclusive is the way that you give that information.
And I was about to add kind of a spicy thing, which is to say that like better the workers than the people you're trying to serve, basically. I mean, that's not to say we want to burden, like healthcare workers or, social workers more. At the same time, if it is a choice of one or the other, right?
Yeah.
In reality, though, I would actually say that like it's probably going to end up on the kind of analysis end, the actual burden. Like data entry, sure, a little bit, but not as much as figuring out what to do with the data later. And to some extent, that is, I think, an appropriate shift.
I love that. Great spicy take, and I think it's one that we all can appreciate. Just as we think about it, shifting burden, let's just not shift it to those we're seeking to serve, right? Let's think about other ways to better streamline and tweak our workflows. I want to pull the thread on sort of on that sort of data collection and management piece and pose this question that we got. How do you handle open self-identification fields from a back-end or database perspective? Do you have to map answers to existing categories, leave it as an uncategorized field, or is there another approach that you take?
I would say that that's the part that's really tricky and weird, is that, for example, with Middle Eastern and Northern African, that maps sometimes just to white. Why? I don't know. And that feels disingenuous. And again, I think that that's the problem with the mechanism. That's the big problem. And so it's really hard to get this clean data. And the same for mapping open text fields. The idea was that you would configure something that is like, if someone puts Mexican, Argentinian, Chicana, that would map to Hispanic or Latino on the back end. But that is burdensome. I totally understand that. But it is like, you would have to manually input those, I think.
I'll give another example, and actually there's someone that I met at this conference that I worked with for like 10-ish years, who decided at that conference to stop separating first and last name for registration and just make it one field. I mean, that acts out a lot of various complications, and the full thing's gonna be on your badge anyway. You can figure out if there are two, that one is small and one is large, and which order that goes in, you can look at a little more closely, but usually in the order listed. And like, there were considerations that we had to kind of look at, and all of the, like, were there times when we just used a first name? Were there times when we just used a last name? But in the end, it worked out that making that change worked for the conference and the attendees.
That's a super helpful example. Thank you. Okay, we're running into our last few minutes, but there's so many more questions. And I'm going to come back to the question on user research. There were a number of questions around compensation, which I think we can all appreciate needs to be the standard. We need to be able to cut through the bureaucracy that says, no, you can't compensate. And I'll share that the Digital Service Network is going to have a resource coming out shortly from the Government Finance Officers Association, GFOA, that will help in this on this topic. So for those of you at the state and local level, stay tuned, because we're working to get you guidance that you can then work with your finance or budget office on. But first, Anne, the question is, at what point did you first notify potential participants that compensation was available? I think the person asking this question was really trying to think about how accessible are you making the opportunity to those who are lower income?
Absolutely. As soon as we talked to the organization in question, we let them know that that was the plan and how much and all of the details. Additionally, we are planning, but have not completed yet, a kind of research recruitment page on our site that describes the process, how much the compensation is, who we're looking for, all of that kind of thing, so that all of those organizations that we talk to can just go look at the details there. They can send people who might be interested there, and they can understand better what they're signing up for beforehand.
Really appreciate that. Let me go back to another question we got sort of in the pattern guidance portion of your presentation. The question is, has there been any research on the inclusive or exclusive impact around the use of between male, female, and man, woman, especially if a form is asking for both sex assigned at birth and gender identity information. So do you know of any research on what impact that the use of those different sort of terms has had?
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure about those particular terms in particular, but I will say that I put some links in the as a reply to that particular question. I'm not sure I can pull them all very quickly, but like, for example, here's the CDC on how and why they're doing it, why it's important. They also have references at the bottom so that you can see the research links from there. We also have our own page on it that has a little bit more information and a whole lot more links available for you to explore over here. As well as there's one other link, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find it really quickly, but there's been some research. I think it's ongoing and will continue to go on.
Excellent. I am really sorry to be the person who has to cut this off, because Ann and Austin, there's still a good 8 to 10 questions I haven't gotten to yet, but unfortunately we are at time. I want to thank everyone for joining today's session. I saw folks in the chat from local government, state government, from private sector, from the nonprofit sector. This is awesome. This is such an exciting sort of illustration of the movement and the number of folks who are fired up about exploring how to make forms more inclusive and accessible. Huge thank you to Austin and Ann for sharing their time and expertise with us today.